Hey, welcome to episode 6 of You're Gonna Be Kidding Me. This part looks at the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle, and it's abbreviated as TALH. Remember, this is the guy that pumps out sodium into the medullary interstitium and makes it salty. So, remember the rule is where salt goes, water follows. That's basic osmosis. But even though this guy is pumping out sodium, water cannot follow here because the thick ascending limb is impermeable to water, so it lacks. It has a very low expression of aquaporins. So even if water wanted to leave, it can't because of low expression of aquaporins. There's this phrase that comes up a bit. Transport concentrations are the same throughout the whole thick ascending limb. Essentially, that means that your Tmax is the same throughout the thick ascending limb, which means that your transporters are not going to be saturated at different levels. So essentially, they're all going to be pumping out the same kind of relatively level of sodium across the whole thick ascending limb. How does it actually pump out sodium? So from your lumen, it takes up sodium. So it takes away sodium from your lumen via your channels called NKCC2. And NKCC2, it takes up one sodium, two Cl minuses, and one potassium. So that's why it's NK, so sodium and potassium, and then CC is for two chlorines, and it's type 2. And it takes these up from the lumen, and then, so this is them taking it up from the lumen, and then here into your epithelial cell. And then your epithelial cell is going to dump the sodium that is taken up from the lumen into the medulla via the basolateral Na+K+ antiporter. So this is the whole point of the thick ascending limb, is to dump sodium into the medulla, and that's how it does it. And just the numbers, because you have to know these as well. The thick ascending limb is responsible for reabsorbing about 20% of sodium in the entire nephron, and the NKCC2 bit as well is also responsible for the uptake of about 25% of potassium ions, K+. Also, it's targeted by the drug Furosemide, which we'll talk about later. And there's a thing which I probably will do another video on called electrogenic transport. And essentially, that is paracellular transport of positive ions that occurs at the thick ascending limb, and you get ions of calcium, potassium, sodium, and magnesium also all being reabsorbed via the paracellular route. So we've established the job of the thick ascending limb is to pump out sodium into the interstitium of the medulla, making it salty, so that water can be drawn out from the thin side of the loop of Henle. And next to your thick ascending limb, you've got your descending vasorector, which is the one that picks up solutes on the way. So let's have a look at the ion channels in a little bit more detail. So here we have our lumen. This is where your filtrate is passing through, and remember, stuff that stays in your lumen ends up in your urine. And on this side we have our interstitium. This is the interstitium of the medulla, and here we have our epithelial cell. So the first channel we'll talk about is one that I've probably mentioned a few times now, is the NKCC2 channel. And this channel takes up 3 different types of ions. So one sodium, so that's the N bit in NKCC2. 2 chloride ions, so that's why there's 2 C's here, so C stands for chloride. And 1 K ion here, so NKCC. And the 2 is just because it's a subtype. So there's also NKCC1 channels as well, but not here. So here you have NKCC2 channels, and these are going to take up these ions. Now, a general rule that you've probably kind of realized in the PCT video is that if an ion is taken up by the lumen on one side, there generally has to be a corresponding channel on the other side. However, for potassium, it's a little bit different. So for potassium here, on the NKCC2, it's a little bit different, because what happens is potassium is taken up by the NKCC2 into the cell, so it kind of chills in the cell for a little bit, and then what happens is there's actually a channel on the same luminal side called the ROMK channel, and the K+ actually the K plus that has come through the NKCC2 channel actually exits back into the lumen again. So the ROMK channel dumps the K plus back into the lumen. So what's the net effect? Your NKCC2 has brought in sodium, 2 chlorides, and potassium, but then a lot of that potassium gets dumped back into the lumen again. Remember, we did say that about 15% of potassium is absorbed, so there is some potassium that is that comes through this side. However, a lot of it actually goes back via the ROMK channel back into the lumen. The net effect is basically NKCC2 is essentially a fancy 2Cl minus Na plus cotransporter. So it takes in two chlorides for every 1 sodium, and potassium kind of cancels out. The corresponding channel of sodium on the basolateral membrane is your sodium, your classic sodium potassium antiporter. So sodium is brought in to the epithelial cells via NKCC2 and then pumped out into the interstitium via your antiporter. This is this channel here is probably the most important one in the thick ascending limb, right? Remember, the point of the thick ascending limb is to get the medulla salti. So this is why we have this channel here. This is a very important guy. And as I said, 3 sodiums are pumped out for 2 K plus brought in. And this essentially is the guy that allows the medulla to become salty. Okay. And so essentially, NKCC2 essentially takes up a lot of sodium and also chloride, and the NaK plus antiporter allows it to be pumped up. There's also a channel, basolateral channel, called, it's a chloride channel called Clc-Ka Barrtin. It's a bit of a mouthful, but yeah, Barrtin is basically a subtype protein that assists the channel essentially. So the chlorine that comes into the epithelium leaves by the transcellular route by the basolateral Clc-Ka Barrtin channel. So this channel has a Barrtin protein in it. Okay, there's also paracellular transport. So let's talk about that. The NKCC2, we said, removes 2 chloride ions from the lumen and 1 Na+, and I haven't counted K because the ROMK channel dumps it back in. So, therefore, it basically removes more negative ions from the luminal side. So it's removing 2 chloride instead of 1 sodium. Therefore, there's less positive sodium ions are removed compared to chlorine ions, which means that we get a buildup of positive charge on this side because more negative charge is being removed by the transcellular route. Now, the kidney isn't a fan of charged membranes, so it wants to get rid of this positive charge somehow that has been built up by this kind of unfair NKCC2. So it was going to try and get rid of it. So what it's going to do, and there's going to be a future video on this because it's more techy, but this is the basics. It sets up something called an electrogenic transport mechanism. Basically, it's a fancy way of saying it sets up a paracellular transport route to get rid of positive ions. Now, what is paracellular transport? If you remember, paracellular transport is when you have ions moving between 2 cells. So here is your other epithelium, and this space here represents a tight junction, so it's a very small space between them. And between them, between tight junctions, between cells, epithelial cells, there's these little proteins here that act like trolls under the bridge. They let only certain people through. And these proteins are called claudines. So claudines are basically, they only allow certain people to go through, and they regulate, therefore, this paracellular shunt. Shunt just means movement of ions. So in the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle, the angry trolls under the bridge are very specific, and they only want to let positive ions through. And those ions are calcium, Ca2+, potassium, K+, Na+, and Mg2+, magnesium. So we've basically said this NKCC2 is unfair. It takes away more negative stuff than positive stuff. And this basically leads to the kidney generating a electrogenic transport mechanism to get rid of these positive ions. And these positive ions are able to pass through the claudins, and therefore we've removed some positive charge as well. So now let's talk about some pathology. Oh, and so it's okay. So to summarize, paracellular movement basically, NKCC2 gets rid of more chlorine than sodium. Therefore, paracellular route tries to get rid of excess positive charge by taking the calcium and the potassium and the sodium and the magnesium. In summarize, by the paracellular route, basically, NKCC2 removes more negative than positive, leading to a buildup of positive charge. This essentially causes the paracellular movement of, so via tight junctions of positive ions such as calcium, magnesium, potassium, and also a little bit of sodium as well. Okay, now let's talk about pathologies. So, right, here we go. There's a thing called Barrters syndrome, and we've said our channels here are CCl CKB Barrtin, which is our chloride channel on the basolateral membrane. We've also got the ROMK thing, and there's also the NKCC2. So mutations in those can be caused by something called Barrters syndrome, which is a rare disorder. Now, what this does, if you're mutating NKCC2, what happens is you're not going to be able to take up any of your sodium or potassium. So you're going to lead to a lot of loss of sodium and K+ in urine. Remember that 15% of K+ is absorbed in the thick ascending limb. So even though ROMK dumps stuff back, you're not going to absorb K+ if you have mutations in NKCC2. So this can lead to a loss of sodium in the urine and potassium. Therefore, this means that the thick ascending limb is not able to do its job. This guy here won't be able to pump any sodium because there's no sodium coming into the cell in the first place. So therefore, the medulla can't be salty. And remember, the rule is where salt goes, water follows by osmosis. So therefore, because there's lots of salt now in the urine, there's going to be lots of water in the urine as well, and this is called polyuria. So your wee is going to become very watery, and because you're weeing out a lot and you're not reabsorbing enough water, this is basically your thin descending limb will not be able to reabsorb enough water, secrete enough water, and then reabsorb it. So this leads to excessive thirst, which is called polydipsia. Okay, there's also another effect here. So we have to just kind of skip forward a little bit, and this will make more sense when we go over the collecting duct stuff. But bear with me for now. In the collecting duct, there are also special cells on the lumen, which are antiporter cells, and these are called alpha intercalating cells. In these alpha intercalating cells, these have a special channel, which is a H+, K+ antiporter. So it takes K+ in, and in order to do that, it needs to kind of sign a pact with the devil. The pact with the devil is in order to get K+ in, you have to dump H+ out. You can see why this is a problem here, because we've said this leads to K+ being dumped in the urine. So your body senses this hyperkalemia, and which is caused by the Barrters syndrome, and therefore it wants to try and fix this somehow. We're like, okay, we need to get more K+ in. In order to do that, it's going to make use of this dirty cell here, and this will take more K+ in, but it has to, the pact with the devil is it has to pump H+ into the urine instead. So because we're putting H+ in the urine, we're generating HCO3 on the basolateral membrane, and we're getting rid of our acid, which means that acid is lost in urine, which basically causes metabolic alkalosis. So a kind of further complication of Barrters syndrome can be metabolic alkalosis. Now, if this mutation happens in the womb, it can be really, really bad. So there's a type of Barrters syndrome called type 4A, and basically because obviously your fetus can't wee out much, or has to be filtered by the placenta. If there's lots of stuff, lots of fluid being kind of generated in the womb, this can accumulate, and the placenta won't be able to get rid of it all. So this is called polyhydroaminos, which can be really bad for the baby, basically leading to the baby to develop in an environment of urine which is obviously not good, and this can also cause deafness. And this is because the 4A Barrters syndrome is caused by mutations in a protein called Barrtin, and Barrtin is important in the thick ascending limb and also the ear. Okay, moving on to diuresis, we're going to look at the diuretic drug, and just in general, diuresis means dilute urine. So that's kind of your clue. So if you give someone a diuretic, you're going to cause their urine to have more water in them. Okay, so you're going to stop reabsorption of water. So the drug that acts on the thick ascending limb is called furosemide, also called furosemide, and it's a loop diuretic. Why is it called a loop diuretic? Because this is part of the loop of Henle. And what this does is it inhibits the NKCC2. So this guy is not going to be working anymore. Therefore, salt cannot be reabsorbed. And remember, our kind of rule was where salt goes, water follows. And because salt is in the urine, water follows in the urine, so water is not going to go from the thin descending limb, water kind of stays there, and your urine becomes watery, so this is called diuresis. So by giving furosemide, we inhibit NKCC2 and we lead to more watery urine. There are a few complications. So if you stop NKCC2, you're also going to stop this mechanism of electrogenic transport, because you're going to stop removing more negative charge than positive charge. So you're also going to stop your paracellular shunt, which means that if you give someone furosemide, you have to make sure that you monitor their calcium, magnesium, and sodium levels, because these might all drop as well. Okay, there's some stuff here as well. Because it acts on the thick ascending limb, the thick ascending limb takes a long time to establish that saltiness via the NAK+ antiporter. So it actually takes around 6 hours. So if you give one pill, it will take 6 hours for the kidney to re-establish that gradient. And it can cause, just as a figure, it can cause 20% of your sodium to be excreted. So that's quite a high amount, and that's why it's called a high ceiling diuretic. Ceiling just means like amount. Also, though, furosemide has something called a high renal clearance. Remember, renal clearance is about how quickly the kidney gets rid of stuff, i.e. it is readily excreted. So the proximal convoluted tubular cells secrete it back into the lumen. So a lot of your furosemide is weed out. So because of the short half-life, you're required to take it 3 times a day. And your dose is 20 milligrams 3 times a day. So that might be an SBA question. And with that dose, diuresis lasts for 6 hours. Also, just a little fact. It's not a fun fact, but anyway, there's a more potent form of furosemide which works in the same way, called bumetanide. Also, one advantage of furosemide is it acts on the other type of NKCC channel, which is called the NKCC1 channel, and this is found in smooth muscles, and it actually causes vasodilation, which is beneficial. This vasodilation is beneficial in treating pulmonary edema. Okay, finally, furosemide. Well, not finally. But furosemide can cause reversible deafness, which is a side effect. However, you never give furosemide with a type of antibiotics called aminoglycosides and vancomycin, because then your deafness may be permanent. Okay, finally here, we're now going to discuss furosemide also has effects on other ions in the other ion exchange in the kidney. So we said the paracellular route is inhibited by stopping the NKCC2, we stop the paracellular reabsorption of positive ions. So therefore, by giving furosemide, you might cause low magnesium, low calcium, and low what's it called? Low potassium. There you go. Right. So K+ as well is also affected. Now, for this, we're going to have to jump slightly ahead of ourselves and look at the cortical collecting duct. And essentially, there's a channel in the cortical collecting duct called ENaC. And ENaC takes up sodium. So ENaC is the sodium kind of channel in the cortical collecting duct. So it takes up sodium from the lumen, but it works in conjunction with ROMK. And basically, so ROMK dumps K plus back into the lumen. Essentially, these two channels act as one big antiporter. So essentially, in the cortical collecting duct, there's an antiporter which takes Na plus in and dumps K plus back into the urine. Now, because furosemide stops NKCC2, it's going to stop sodium absorption at the loop of Henle. We've already know that. So we said this stops sodium being reabsorbed, which leads to watery urine. And so this means your plasma volume is going to decrease because you're weeing out a lot. So your plasma volume contracts. So that's called a volume contraction. So far there's nothing new there. Okay, the new thing here is that because your plasma volume decreases, this is kind of sensed by your kidney, and this leads to the hormone aldosterone being released. And we'll talk about aldosterone separately in a future video. But aldosterone is released in response to falling blood volumes. So this leads to the collecting duct trying to get sodium again. Why? Because your kidney has sensed that your volume, it's basically you're weeing out too much, right? So your collecting duct, which is responsible for fine-tuning the water balance, wants to get more sodium in, because why? Because where sodium goes, water follows. So basically your collecting duct is trying to get more water in to correct this volume contraction. So again, it's kind of like another deal with the devil. In order to take up more sodium, which is a good thing to take up more water, because, well, it's not a good thing, but it's your body is trying to correct itself against this furosemide. It has to sign a deal with the devil, and the contract is that in order to take up sodium, yes, you can take up your sodium, but you're going to have to dump K plus back into the lumen. Basically, you're going to have to wee out K plus. Basically, the ROMK channel is working more because ENaC is working more. Remember, this is basically an antiporter, so when one works more, the other works more in the cortical collecting duct. So ROMK is working more, dumping more K plus back into the urine. So you're going to wee out a lot of K plus. So giving furosemide can also cause hypokalemia. So can lead to low magnesium, calcium, and potassium, and also can lead to low potassium via this transporter here, via the ROMK in the cortical collecting duct. Okay, finally, H plus concentrations are also affected. Again, we have to jump ahead of ourselves and look at the cortical collecting tubule. And there's a special type of antiporter here, which I mentioned in the Barrtin one, which takes K plus up and dumps out H plus. So because of this low K plus here, the hypokalemia, your cortical collecting tubule will try and correct that. So it will try and take more K plus in. And it does this via the H plus K plus antiporter on the alpha intercalating cells on the cortical collecting tubule. But in order to get more K plus in, again, it has to do a deal with the devil. So in order to correct for this hypokalemia, it will try and get more calcium, more potassium in, but it will have to, in order to do that, it has to sacrifice hydrogen. So it has to dump hydrogen out into the lumen. So I'm sorry to see you go, hydrogen, but out you go. So the urine becomes more acidic, leading to the blood becoming more alkaline. So every time we pump out H plus here, we generate HCO3 minus on the basolateral side, and also we're getting rid of our own acid. So this is called volume contraction, because, well, volume contraction has happened because your plasma volume has decreased, and it's alkalosis because you're dumping out H plus. So overall, there's effects on Mg2 plus, Ca2 plus, and potassium. You get low potassium in your blood, and you can also cause volume contraction, alkalosis. These are all side effects of furosemide.